good morning, depending on where you are. This is Kate Kramer, the Deputy Executive Director here at Advance CTE. I'm really excited about today's webinar. We're joined by some of our partners from the Fordham Institute to talk about some new research they've put out about how well-aligned CTE programs and course offerings are to local labor market demands. We'll have a chance for them to share their research, us to give a little bit of our thoughts and responses to that, but then really leave quite a bit of time for open Q&A. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, please put them in the chat box. We'll then have, as I said, ample time for Q&A on the back end. Also just want to share that we are recording this webinar and we'll be posting the recording within the next 24 hours on our website for anybody who is missing it. So really briefly, I just want to share who we have joining us today. Our speakers are David Griffith, a Senior Research and Policy Associate with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, one of the co-authors of the report, as well as Amber Northam, who is Fordham's Senior Vice President for Research and played a big instrumental role in this, and then myself, Kate Kramer. So I am going to turn it over to Amber and David to walk through the report, walk through the findings, a lot to dig into, and then we'll circle back and share what Advance CTE is thinking about this. Okay, David, you are now in control of the slides. Hi, David or Amber, are you guys?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. We can hear you. You guys want to walk through the report and get started?
Yeah, sure thing. Amber, are you there?
Hello? Am I muted?
You are now.
Am I muted?
We can hear you. We can now hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. Am I muted now? Hello?
Nope, we can hear you.
We can hear you. All right. Sorry, I was talking into space, going, I'm here. All right. Sorry, you guys, for the technological difficulty. Anyhow, I'm Amber Northern. I'm happy to present the overview of the findings today with my colleague David Griffith, who was a co-author of the report, along with Cameron Sublett, who is a professor at Pepperdine. I'm going to run just through the beginning, just the first few slides where I introduce the study and why we cared about doing this study. David's going to run through the findings for you, and then I'll loop back at the end and talk a little bit about the implications and the caveats to the report that we want to make sure folks understand. So the reason why we started sort of the study in the first place was that we just kept hearing so much about, aligning high school CTE to the labor market, and what were the purpose of these courses that kids were taking in high school, and was there any sort of signal in terms of whether kids were taking courses that were more prevalent in their local economy, and or where they were taking courses in industries that tended to be higher paying. So that's kind of, where the impetus began. And we know that the recent reauthorization of the CTE, the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, had in it explicit language around aiming to align workforce skills with labor market needs. So we know that that's an interest and a focus, but it seemed to us that no one had really done a systematic study that seriously looked at whether that alignment was occurring, at least to some degree, at the high school level. So this is the first, again, to our knowledge, it's able to look at this question of alignment of high school CTE at the national and local level. Again, it's not a perfect study, but we'll get into some of that. All right, David, take me to the next slide. All right, awesome. So here's what we wanted to find out. These are our research questions. Again, whether national CTE course taking patterns reflect the distribution of jobs across these various fields and industry, whether those CTE course-taking patterns were linked to local employment and industry wages, as I indicated, and then we looked at whether some of these patterns differed by race and gender. And so, again, just real briefly, how do we define demand? And we defined it both ways, by whether jobs are, again, more popular and prevalent locally, and whether they tend to be higher paying. And then we looked at 10 local areas. So we weren't able to obviously do this study at every single local area across the country, because in some cases you don't have enough data or insights or students participating to be able to do a robust analysis. But if you look at the report, you'll see that we did do a deep dive into 10 local areas aside from the national findings that we'll talk about today. And those areas were Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Houston, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, New York, Phoenix, and Seattle. So if you're from any of those places and you haven't dug into the profiles and the report towards the end of the report, you might want to do that. All right, our approach. Okay. So here, again, we're just in brief. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys care about methodology. Some of you will and do, and there's definitely more in the report that talks about the approach that we took. But in brief, the data on CTE course taking come from the high school longitudinal survey, which have a number of data points about what types of courses kids take and, kind of what those courses look like. And then we looked at employment and wages from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then the big challenge was trying to connect those two data sources together. And so in brief, we took the 459 occupations that are in the BLS classification system and mapped them to one of the 16 career clusters that I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with. So if we had this BLS occupation called food scientist and technologist, they were assigned to the AF&C, Agricultural, Food, and Natural Resources cluster. We did not do that matching ourselves. That was actually done by the National Research Center for Career and Technology and Education. That was a crosswalk that is publicly available that we used. And so after we were able to connect those data sources, again, this allowed us to calculate the employment shares and average wages for each cluster. So then we could compare the distribution of the course taking to the distribution of jobs. And again, we looked at that at both the national and the local level. We'll get into this a little bit later, but I think one of the things that we talked about is, yes, we're relying on these clusters, and there's not, they're sort of the best that we have in terms of, how we think about how these courses hang together. But we know that these courses have their own issues, and we'll talk about that again. But sometimes the courses under a cluster, they seem sort of like an odd fit when you look at the course name and the cluster name, and you're like, well, that's kind of odd. So there are problems, I think, with these clusters, but we can talk about that. This is a rough cut. These clusters are really big, as you guys know. They cover a lot of territory, and so sometimes that creates problems as well that has implications that we can loop back to. And the HLS data are a few years old, so we can talk about that as well. So in some cases, we can say, well, maybe the patterns have changed in more recent years. And I know a report came out today on CTE course taking and participation that kind of says there have been some trends and differences in the types of kids who are taking a CTE. So in some ways, our data are somewhat dated in that respect. And then the next slide, David. It's just, I just take for granted that folks know these acronyms when we talk about the clusters, and I know that I can't tell you how many times I had to go back to this little key and legend here and remind myself what these things meant. So again, if that's you, here's a quick reminder of what these things are, because you're going to see the acronym as David goes to the slides and the figures. And again, this is just a reminder of what all those acronyms are that we know and love. And I think we are ready with that quick overview for David to dig into the key findings of the report. And I'll see you on the back end.
All right, can everyone hear me? I'm going to run through this as quickly as I can, just in the interest of time. So as Amber was saying, our goal was really just to try and take a first cut at this question, which is obviously a really big question. And to our knowledge, had really not been done like this before, even at this kind of really crude level. So as you can see in Figure 1, when we just break down the types of jobs that exist in the U.S. in terms of the 16 clusters, a couple things jump out pretty quickly. First of all, some clusters are a lot bigger than others. There's no bright line here, but we illustrated this just to kind of show that actually, 4 of these clusters account for over half of the jobs in the U.S. And some of the clusters that we hear a lot about, like IT and STEM, as wonderful as they are, they don't actually support that many jobs. So I think, right off the bat, you can see sort of one of the central conundrums here, which is this trade-off between, I guess, the quality and the quantity of the jobs. Some of the highest paying jobs that we consider most desirable don't actually, there aren't that many of them. So I certainly don't have all the answers there, but that's just a sort of first order observation. And then sort of looking at the other side of the equation, if we look at figure 2, four of these clusters account for over half of CTE course taking nationally, but it's not the same 4. And that may be all right, but again, it's just sort of noteworthy. So IT is obviously a cluster where there's a lot of course taking. Business management is one that appears in both slides. But then, you also see agriculture, food, and natural resources, which covers a lot, obviously, but accounts for a far greater share of course taking than it does jobs. And similar with arts, audiovisual technology and communication, which also sees a lot of course taking. And as Amber mentioned, there are probably some coding issues buried into this, but this is sort of the first cut. Okay. Great. All right, and then figure 3 just shows the same thing, but for CTE concentrations. So the picture is a little different here. You can see that health science, which is obviously an industry that supports a lot of jobs and is expected to support more, accounts for a significant share of national concentrations. And then also architecture and construction is another major area of concentration where there's more concentrators than there are sort of course takers, proportionally speaking. All right, and then this is just sort of visualizing the data in a couple of different ways, right? So this sort of presents the 16 clusters in order of average wage, right? So at one end, you've got hospitality, and then at the other end, you've got STEM, and then you can sort of see the percentage of employment that each cluster accounts for, and then the percentage of total CTE course taking they account for. So the first thing that jumps out that's pretty obvious is that there's a ton of CTE, if that's what you want to call it, course taking in IT relative to its actual formal employment share. And there's similarly, you see the same thing with arts and audiovisual technology and with agriculture. And then conversely, there are areas where, there's a lot of jobs, but it, proportionally speaking, doesn't account for a lot of CTE course taking. So hospitality, manufacturing, marketing. And I guess I should just say, to be really clear, we're not making any normative judgments here, right? So the takeaway is not that, we need to quadruple our marketing course taking or, triple the amount of course taking in manufacturing. That's not what we're saying. But we sort of have to start with this to even have that conversation. So our goal was, I think our first order goal was just to present the data so that people could have that conversation, basically. All right, and then this sort of does a similar thing for concentration rates. So I think the big takeaway here, right, is we define concentration as taking at least three courses in the same cluster, partly because that's what we were able to do with the data, partly because, I don't want to get too far into it, but obviously there is some disagreement over what concentration should look like or what should count, and then you can also question whether it's the best measure of sort of genuine CTE engagement. But either way, you can certainly see that there, from this graph, that the percentage of all U.S. students, not the percentage of students who do CTE, but the percentage of all U.S. students who concentrate in any one of these clusters is far smaller than the percentage of employment that cluster accounts for. So even in areas like health science, where there is, comparatively speaking, a lot of CTE concentrations, it's still not really close to the number of actual percentage of actual individuals who work in health science. So again, that's just sort of noteworthy. It doesn't necessarily point in any particular direction, except perhaps that a great deal more career and technical education is certainly possible in some of these areas. Okay, and then, so we also looked at the data in a different way. Everything that I just presented was national, but we also looked at the relationship between wages and employment and locally. So what I mean by that is we were able to calculate the employment share and average wages in these clusters for almost every metropolitan statistical area in the country, and then relate that to either course taking and concentrations. And our goal was just to see if there is any real relationship between supply and demand, really, because it's possible. I mean, these are teenagers we're talking about, and bureaucracies. It's certainly possible that there is no relationship. The good news here, the main takeaway that you're supposed to get from this graph, is that there actually is a relationship in most of these clusters between local employment and local course taking. So, for example, if you look at the first one, agriculture, food, and natural resources, this is telling us that for every 1 percentage point increase in local employment, for example, if agriculture accounts for 4% rather than 3% of local employment, there is a 4 percentage point increase in the individual student's probability of taking at least one agriculture course. So that's a lot, but I think that the big takeaway is that in most of these areas, we do see there is some positive relationship between course taking and employment. However, when we look at the relationship between course taking or concentration and wages, it's a somewhat different picture. And we can probably get into this more, but at least using the methodology that we did, which controlled for as many individual student characteristics as we could, it appeared that at least in some of these areas, there is a negative relationship between the average local wages that an industry pays and students' probability of taking coursework. And that may seem counterintuitive, but I think our interpretation was just that, at least in some of these areas, high school CTE isn't necessarily connecting students with highest paying jobs within a particular field. Okay, and then our third research question was really, do we see any interesting differences when it comes to race or gender when we look at the types of courses that kids are taking? Obviously, there's sort of a sordid history when it comes to the role of vocational education, and it's a concern when we're talking about some of these pathways that they really are helping kids and represent the best outcome for kids. So we just wanted to look at that that angle to see what more recent data showed. And so this first graph just shows the percentage of students who concentrate in a particular area, male versus female. And as you can see from the graph, there are still particular areas like health science where female students are far more likely to concentrate than male students. And conversely, there are areas like IT and transportation and architecture and construction where male students are far more likely to concentrate than female students. That's not necessarily shocking, but it does suggest that in some of these areas, traditional gender roles haven't necessarily changed as much as we might think. And so this is the similar sort of the similar graph for CTE concentration by race, white, Black, and Hispanic students. This is kind of an interesting chart, to me at least. It's at least notable. In some cases, these differences aren't necessarily statistically significant. Nevertheless, you can see that actually Black students or African American students take at least as many IT courses as white students. They take at least as many health science courses, at least in the sample we had, at least as many business courses. White students, the biggest difference is that in the chart, right, is that white students take far more agriculture, food, and natural resources courses, which is interesting because, that's actually one of the lower paying clusters. So we can certainly get into this some more, but I think, we were, I guess, somewhat encouraged by some of these data because it certainly suggests that it's a more complicated story than just CTE is a lower track for students of color. And then just kind of making that point in an even simpler way, white students are at least as likely as Black and Hispanic students to concentrate in CTE now, which is notable in and of itself. So I think there's obviously a much longer conversation to be had here in terms of what do we make of these data, how much can they tell us, but we thought that was interesting and notable, and I think pretty different from whatever the data would have shown 40 years ago. All right, and then real quickly, we did profile some of a handful of cities. Unfortunately, the data just, even though we had 16,000 students, once you start dividing it up by city and by 16 clusters, the n sizes get pretty small pretty quickly. Nevertheless, this sort of shows an example of what we were able to do in Houston. The big takeaway, at least for me, from the ones that we were able to profile, is that actually in terms of employment, there's not as much difference, at least when you look by the clusters, as you might think between locations, or at least between metropolitan locations. You can see that the four biggest employment clusters in Houston are the same four that we see nationally. And if you look at wages over on the right, the picture is really similar. So one of my personal takeaways from this report was that it's possible to make too much of the notion of local alignment. We all think that, you think about Manhattan, you think about Wall Street, but the percentage of folks in Manhattan who work on Wall Street is probably actually pretty small. There's probably plenty of dentists, plenty of folks who work in the service industry, no matter where you go. So I think that's interesting and just kind of important to bear in mind. All right. Okay. Amber, I think I'm supposed to hand it off to you here at some point. I can't see the numbers of the slides, but I think we're just about there.
Okay, great. Yep. We'll talk a little bit about the caveats. I think, we've obviously been just kind of looking at some of the feedback that we've gotten from the CTE community and other organizations, and these are some of the things that we also discussed in the report. But the point I indicated earlier, these are older data. They come from 2009 through 2012. We're following one cohort of students here. So to the extent that the CTE landscape has changed in the last 7 years, it's not going to be reflected in this report. And these new data are they come out with new iterations of these data sets, pretty frequently. So this is the type of report that could be updated in the future. We could begin to see whether some of these patterns we're seeing have evolved in more recent years. And then I was looking at some feedback from Excel and Ed, our friends in Florida, and they brought up, a point I think that we didn't discuss in the report that bears mentioning. And again, it's this, we're looking at alignment at the career cluster level again, and that's going to mask differences by program level. So we know that, for instance, both food science workers and floral design workers are in agriculture, food, and natural resources, that particular cluster. So if you're seeing differences in alignment by those, particular sort of subfields, that's not something that this report is going to be able to pick up because, again, these career clusters are pretty big. And so, if we could ever get down to a more fine-grained level, that would obviously be great. But this particular data set did not allow us to get peel the onion back any further than we did. And then I guess, at the risk of sort of beating a dead horse, these course codes can sometimes be problematic. We gave an example in the report where the titles of the most popular IT courses suggest that their purposes are pretty general. So computer and information technology, for instance, and computer applications account for 53% of IT course taking. And then when you add in a course called Introduction to Computer Technology and Web Design, that figure rises to about 70%. So these are courses that I think some might not associate with CTE because, again, they tend to be, or they sound a little more generalized than industry specific. And then we talked already that these concentration definitions vary across states. So if your state doesn't use our definition, then these patterns may look different. And then also, the very obvious point that students can't take what's not offered. So that these results are both reflecting students' decisions about which courses to take, but also district decisions about what courses they're offering. And we know that, particularly in some rural areas, they can't offer courses in every single one of these clusters. And so sometimes they concentrate on, 3 or 5 clusters, and kids are only offered courses in those areas. And then the last slide, David, if you can get to the takeaways. Again, it's just, we talk about these in the report. I'll run through them quickly. But, there's significant potential for greater alignment, which David talked about, to the extent that, you think kids should be taking jobs in the places where there are the most jobs nationally, then there's obviously room for alignment. If you think that kids should be doing a lot more CTE, the picture's kind of bleak on that because we know that at least for the years we looked here, we're still seeing overall low levels of concentration. But that said, there's some good news. Again, we see some signals where kids tend to be taking taking courses in areas where there are more jobs, even though that's not holding up on the wages side. And so that's what we say in point 3, that we still think that in many ways that they're not connecting them with the higher paying fields. Still, again, there's reasons for that we can talk about, and that's sort of a larger discussion. And then point 4 is just the definition of alignment. We still think that there's not complete clarity in the CTE community and sector relative to how they want to think about an operational alignment. I think there are trade-offs here, and some states are seeing CTE as more broad and as general preparation. Some of you are likely aware that at least 20 states allow students to apply specific computer science courses toward their math or science graduation requirements, which in my mind means that they view those computer science courses as a suitable replacement for traditional core courses. Which kind of says, okay, are they seeing CT as more generic or general preparation? And then other places, and people will talk very explicitly about CT being industry-specific preparation. And then you hear other people talk about, well, CT should really expose kids to various fields in high school because how else are they going to know whether they're interested in it? So we should have this sort of exposure purpose of CTE. So in many ways, I think the field would benefit from, more clarity about, what we think needs to be aligned and how that aligns with the one or more purposes of CTE. And then finally, we've got this point about tracking, and at least in our report, we said, we don't see some of these historic differences between participation in these particular types of fields between students of color and white kids, and so that's a data point. But of course, that's not saying that there's absolutely no evidence of tracking and it's completely gone. And even today, I mentioned a report that came out that shows that there's still some evidence that there's some differences between kids who take some of these more forward-looking courses in these sort of newer fields, and again, some of these historic vo-tech clusters that we tend to associate with traditional vo-tech, and that there's a difference among kids in what they perform, how they think about their future in these courses that they take. So I think there's still some evidence that we've not gotten rid of the stigma, so to speak, or even the tracking completely. And so I'm going to stop there. We probably went over our time, but we've got a good 30 minutes for Kate's response and some questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Amber and David. I will not take 30 minutes to respond. I think you guys fill a lot of your caveats in terms of what I'm going to dig into, but just I think to kind of put, a finer point on some of those takeaways. So kind of I organize our reaction into the good, the not so good, and then the head scratchers in terms of things we just cannot explain in this data. So I think first and foremost, as Amber and David kind of articulated, I think the report raises important questions about alignment. What are we aligning to, which we'll come back to. We take some concerns about what the alignment is to in this report, but that is an important conversation about what the programs and pathways are aligned to and who has access to and is supported through aligned programs and programs of study. Being able to have important questions about where there are gaps in program offerings, which is something obviously through Perkins 5 is a big focus of the local needs assessment and some of the work that states and locals are required to do. And then I think it also raises a number of challenges that when you dig really deeply into labor market information, you start to see that don't always bubble up kind of in the national level conversation. So IT, I think, is a great one, right, where in the paper, there's this curious case of information technology where you say it's only 2% of jobs. Well, we know that there are over 500,000 jobs from BLS that are in computer services and IT. When you look at the occupations, when you look at it from the sector, it gets buried because so many of those IT jobs are embedded in other sectors, or embedded in the business sector, embedded in the health science sector. And so that's one that as states and locals are thinking about how they're looking at labor market data, what are the ways you validate, what are the different sources that are coming into play, that you're not just looking at one data source, but having a much more well-rounded and kind of scaffolded conversation about what that demand in the high-skill, high-wage careers are. So I think these are things that states and locals have been and will continue to grapple with moving forward, but the nuances of that labor market information is so complex and so important to kind of raise. I think another really important question from our perspective is looking at, to the point you made in terms of students can take what's offered in their schools, and getting a sense of, the offerings, and particularly more on the participation, which I'll dig into more kind of on the next slide, of whether they're really offering high-quality programs and courses, or whether they're offering those that are the easiest to offer and, frankly, sometimes the cheapest to offer, right? There's a huge participation in arts AV and IT, in business, because those are courses that are the graphic design, the Photoshop, that students like taking and frankly are not that expensive to take. You have some computers, you buy some software, you may or may not need an instructor that has industry expertise compared to the manufacturing, the health science, that are going to have more equipment costs, that are going to require having that instructor that has industry expertise, that has an industry credential aligned to it. So I'm not saying this report gives us the answer to that question, but I think it's one as we think about what states want to invest their resources in, what they really want to encourage locals to be offering. Part of that is student interest, but it also has to be looking at what are really the quality offerings that, of course, align to what industry is demanding both today and tomorrow. So that's what we kind of stood out as some of the really important, why we think this report is important. Some of the things that we took a little bit of umbrage with, and a lot of these Amber and David just spoke to, first and foremost is the focus on in demand, right, versus what we talk about in our field is high skill, high wage, and actually in demand or high demand depending on which Perkins you're looking at. And so when we think about over half the jobs are in these in demand fields, well, of course they are, but they're not necessarily the good jobs. These are, when you look at, particularly marketing, those are retail jobs. When you're looking at hospitality, those are service sector jobs. Not that these are not jobs with value, but these are not the jobs that we should be aligning our CTE programs to, because they are historically low wage, dead end, do not pay a family sustaining wage, do not have pathways to advancement. Not universally, but that is often the case. Versus jobs that hit all the high skill, high wage, and in demand, looking at multiple dimensions. And this is critically important for programs that start at the secondary level in particular, because we are not a workforce development program, we are an educational pathway. I think another challenge, and again, the data is the data, and the data has a lot of challenges, a lot of lags. We just put out a report about the kind of lack of quality and effectiveness of a lot of state data that often is what gets reported up to the feds, whether to the Department of Education or to the National Center for Education Statistics. We know there are challenges in the data, similar with labor market data, but I think there's limitations of looking at current jobs versus being able to also look at projections and not just what is available today. And again, many of those in-demand jobs, there's a lot of openings because there's incredibly high turnover, versus what are the jobs and opportunities that are down the line that are 5, 10 years that we want to grow into. And I think, one example is in Wisconsin with the new Foxconn contract that's there, a number of other employers, they're creating this new Industry 4.0 that kind of bridges manufacturing and IT and computer science and all these industries together, and now the community is working to create some new pathways, new opportunities in partnership between secondary, post-secondary that align to this new industry demand they know is coming, not today, not tomorrow, but in 5, 10 years, and being able to have that flexibility. So I think that's just another thing as states are and locals are looking at labor market information, not just looking at snapshots in time today, but also looking more broadly. We already talked through the definition of concentrator. I think it's a tough thing to do in terms of how states are defining it. We really focus on the students that just happen to be taking a course or multiple electives that happen to be in the same cluster versus those that are taking an intentional sequence of courses that start introductory and get more occupationally specific over time are going to have different experiences. And those programs are designed differently with different intents and have different outcomes. And there was a study that AI commissioned a few months ago that looked at course taking in Texas, and they found that 45% of the high school graduates were actually explorers who took 3 or more courses in a single cluster but did not concentrate. So they're taking a lot of introductory courses that all happen to be in arts AV or all happen to be in IT, but aren't actually adding up to a true pathway. And so, again, you're going to have different outcomes because a student might just be taking what their school is offering. They might have a lot of electives, availability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're thinking about this is part of my career path versus these are the courses I'm taking to graduate that I'm enjoying, which opens up a lot of questions about how do we get more kids to concentrators, which is something that I think we agree with Fordham. That those numbers are still really low. We've been stuck at about 20% of all high school students concentrating for the last decade. We'd love to see that number grow and hope there's opportunity to do so. Talk a little about this focus on participants. We frankly don't think there's a lot of weight to be put on participation. These are students that are taking electives. Almost every state requires electives. Often they're open electives. They're not required in a specific field. They're filling, their courses to graduate. They're filling the courses they want to take. And so, again, I'm hesitant I think concentrators, although we might squabble on whether it's 3 in a cluster, whether it's in a pathway, understanding that still you're getting a better sense of, there's more comparability. Participation, we just don't think really tells much of a story because over 80% of graduates are taking at least one CTE course because those are those elective courses. And then we already talked about the data lag. Amber kind of spoke about it, and so I don't need to go into it, but we just know a lot of progress has happened in the past 7 years. I'm not saying if we ran the data today, if we had the ability to run the data today, that it would come out perfectly or perfectly aligned or we've solved all of our challenges. We haven't, but as an organization that represents state leaders and states, we do want to recognize that they've made a lot of intentionality around improving the quality of their programs, which looks at both, are their courses rigorous, are they intentionally sequenced, is there labor market justification, are they anchored in high quality credentials, and so, again, we haven't solved, there's still work to do, but there's been so much progress that we want to acknowledge. So the things that I can't explain, and I'm not going to pretend to explain, first and foremost, the relationship between the increased wages and lower rates of concentration. I'd say nationally, it's probably hard to do some of those. We're not really sure. I can't explain it. I would say we don't have a reason to believe there would or should be a relationship between wages and participation. Again, given those are just often the courses that are of interest, that students like to take, that are not expensive to take, that aren't necessarily designed to be part of a student's career path if they're just participating in that course. And then I think importantly, there's a correlation, there's a relationship between these, there's not causation, right? And not that the report suggests in any way there is, but I think just putting it down that these two things are happening simultaneously, but we can't say that it's happening because of one or the other. Wages are going up and course taking is going down or vice versa. And then, I know we had different definitions of concentrators, what states report up to Octane, the Department of Education, as part of their Perkins reporting versus kind of the approach that Fordham took. But some of the numbers were pretty dramatic, where they found 17.4% of all concentrators were in IT. The national data at PCRN is only 6.5%. Similarly, there was about a 3 percentage point difference for STEM concentrators. So again, I think it just calls into question the data we're working off of and some of the limitations we have, because there's just a different view and different ways that states might be counting them versus the researchers were counting them based on what they were seeing in the data. So kind of our bottom line, some of these things have been said, but I'm just going to put a fine point. First and foremost, that CT is an educational pathway. It is not a workforce development program, particularly at the secondary level, which is where this report is focusing in. So yes, while there should be alignment between CT programs and the labor market around them, looking at demand only is a way that you often focus on workforce development. It is not looking at the high skill, high wage. We are about creating pathways into careers for students that give them lifelong success. And so that's, from our perspective, the intent. That means there's exploration at the earlier end and broader courses introductory. But that does mean it does get more occupation-specific over time, but not closing doors and taking a broader lens of what the careers we're preparing students for. Two, I know I didn't put this in the earlier findings. I think we're a little troubled by the notion, and I know Amber couched a little bit more today on the webinar and the new report that came out earlier today from AAI that looked at kind of student participation in different program areas. But we don't think we can or should discount the possibility of tracking without asking questions about program quality and examining program level data. And so I think this was mentioned that the clusters mask a lot. Just because you're seeing more students from a certain demographic in a health science program does not mean that those are all equally rigorous health science programs with good outcomes. So if you don't know the program level outcome data and we're not actually looking at being able to ask questions about that quality, we can't make any statements about tracking and are hesitant to do so. We can make some statements that non-traditional participation and enrollment and completion continues to be a problem. That is something that your data showed, all the data shows, and we know is one that continues to be a priority. And then finally, you know, we think that there's actually a lot of opportunities under Perkins 5 to operationalize alignment, right? A stronger focus on high skill, high wage, and demand, you know, give states flexibility in terms of how they define those and thinking about how to build off of align to, but not necessarily adopt wholesale, the definition in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, but now within the new local needs assessment, locals are required to look at this data and assess where they're at in terms of their program offerings and kind of enrollment in those programs based on labor market information. And it puts a lot, an onus, I think, on states to provide that labor market information to locals, not just at the national level, but at the regional level, local level, to really be able to dig in and provide, I think, some supports for how to use that data. It's also, you know, called out much more explicitly throughout the law, and I think really raises important questions that states have been doing work under Perkins 4, but will do much more intentional work under Perkins 5 around labor market information. So that's, I'm going to pause because I want to make sure we've got some time for questions. So please, if you have questions for me, if you have questions for Amber or David, or just things you think are worth sharing on these topics, please put them in the chat box. And my colleague Ashley McFadden is here to help moderate those questions.
Yeah, hi everyone. We've already received a few questions through the chat box. So again, please continue to send them. So this is for the first one. I've got kind of two related questions for David and Amber, kind of specific to the report and sort of the how of the report. So one, how, if at all, did you correlate the national career clusters to the California industry sectors in your local review of Los Angeles data? So what was the process, if there was one, for, or am I like crosswalking, the California industry sectors versus the national career clusters? And then as a follow-up to that also, do you know, are there any plans in the works? You mentioned that the report might be updated with new data, so just a question around, are there specific plans or timeline for that, or is that more of a once the new data becomes available?
Well, I'll jump in. I'm not 100% sure I understand the first question. We use the same process for the local profiles that we use nationally. So it's basically the Bureau of Labor Statistics occupations are assigned to one of the 16 clusters based on the crosswalk that Amber mentioned. And then we were able to connect to the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports these numbers at the state and MSA level. So for any given area like Los Angeles, we could see, you know, here are the number of jobs in this particular group of occupations, which we placed under a cluster. So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but that's how we did it. And I'll let Amber speak to whether we want to do this again anytime soon. It's a whole lot of work.
Yeah, it's a whole lot of work, but yeah, I mean, I think it's something we want to follow, and obviously, hey, if we get some more funding to do refresh, we definitely consider it, but it's not officially in our plans yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think our hope is that, it's probably the hope of everyone on this call that states will take up this work, right? Ultimately, I mean, it took us almost 2 years to do this, and it obviously takes NCS, some time to aggregate the data, and that is, we didn't have this idea the minute that the data became available either. So, you wind up with this sort of frustrating lag. I'm 100% sure that a well-motivated, well-organized State Department of Education could do this much more quickly and sort of make it feel less like something that happened 7 years ago and more like something that happened 2 years ago. I will say, though, there have been a couple other studies in the Texas study that was alluded to and the California study, and they're not directly you can't make direct comparisons, but they show at least broadly similar pictures to what we got here. So I think in many parts of the country, I'm not sure that the picture has changed that much. We did get some feedback in some other areas. New York City comes to mind, where the reaction was, well, things have changed a lot in the last 5 years. So I obviously can't speak to that, but I do think this stuff probably it doesn't move at the speed of light. So information from 3 to 4 years ago is probably not terrible information in my view.
Great, thank you. So another question we had come in, so given that the data was more historical, going forward, kind of how might we address sort of those emerging trends in different industries, so things that aren't showing up in data from 4 years ago because they're sort of newer industries or newer programs, and how might we think about that going forward? And I'll open that up, I think, to Kate and David and Amber as well, if they have any thoughts.
Kate, go for it.
Well, so that's a good question. So I think it's harder to capture in the data, right? So I think when we've seen states want to be able to capture emerging labor market data that's not going to show up in, whether you're using an off-the-shelf burning glass or MC where they're doing job posting listings, or you're pulling data from your economic development that's kind of based on, the current flow. What we've seen, and this is something that is allowable in Perkins 5 with the local needs assessment, we've also seen some states kind of create grant programs to do this. We've seen it built into kind of a local justification process, is that essentially the locals say, look, we know we've got this industry coming, we've got this sector coming in, we've got these employers coming to us that are in this new cluster or in this new sector, and we want to be able to be responsive. And so what a number of states have done is create kind of processes for locals to either through kind of incentive funds, through their own kind of program approval processes, or otherwise say, here's our justification, not one employer signing off on this, but a number of employers and, our economic development region signing off on this. So it's harder to show up in the data where you kind of run the data from your state or from whatever process, and here it is, here's our emerging sectors, because it may just not show up yet. But it's coming, you have those employer partners, you're able to then kind of build a program that forecasts where it's going. And so under the new local needs assessment process, essentially it's look at the labor market data, but there's language to say, other evidence you want to bring forward that justifies your current programs or programs you want to be creating down the line. I'm paraphrasing that, but that is something that's allowable. So I think it's like a workaround, and for the state, you need to just make sure you have clear thresholds of it cannot be one employer, because we're not just kind of funneling kids into this one employer, but having the right processes in place that allow for that flexibility at the local and regional level to be able to be responsive to the economy and where it's going.
Great, thank you. So our next question is for Kate. So can you discuss more about the point you made about CTE being an education pathway and not a workforce development program? given that this discussion is about aligning labor market data to programs?
Sure. So I think where this really comes in is when you're looking at labor market alignment and looking at multiple dimensions of labor market alignment. So not just looking at in demand. If you look at in demand, those are the jobs that if you look at any of the, if you look at BLS data, ONET data, any of the data, and you look at where there are the most job openings, overwhelmingly they are jobs that do not require a high school diploma or any additional training. They do not pay a family-sustaining wage. So those are where a lot of the jobs are, and they also have much higher turnover rates, so there's always going to be job openings, not just like they have a lot of number of jobs, but also the highest job openings. So those are important jobs, and I think people, particularly as people are coming in that are underskilled, that are unemployed, as part of an individual's pathway, I'm not discounting those jobs. When we talk about career technical education, and again, focusing particularly on secondary programs, we are not preparing students, and we as an organization do not support this. This is not kind of how we would define a high-quality CTE program of study, is one that is just focusing on low-skill jobs. We want to look at in-demand as well as high-skill and high-wage, and we think it's really important to look at all those thresholds. So states like Nebraska under Perkins 4 kind of came up with a construct for all three of those and said, we want to align our CTE programs for career opportunities, career pathways that meet the threshold across the board. So there has to be a minimum kind of either entry level or median wage in this career. There needs to be demand, of course, but there also needs to be a certain skill level that we're anticipating, which is something that ONET, for example, kind of does look at what the skill levels are. And having that calibration across multiple dimensions, so we're not saying, great, CT student, you are going to we're going to give you a job, we're going to prepare you for this retail job at Macy's, that maybe, if you're lucky, you'll get into the management program in Excel, but that is not the path for the vast majority of people that are there. It doesn't mean that it's not possible, and maybe that's a work-based learning opportunity for students if their path is they want to go into management, or they wanted to go into sales, or they wanted to go into marketing and want to learn it from the ground up. But we're very hesitant to just assume that's the intent for all those students and have those jobs. So again, when we think about it as an educational pathway, we think it has to be across multiple dimensions to really make sure we're not closing doors for students, but keeping all those opportunities open.
Yeah, I'll jump in here just for a bit too, just since I have some thoughts on this. I mean, we did sort of toy with the idea of trying to come up with some standard, and it's just very hard to do. I mean, you have within any given cluster, there's dozens of jobs, and it's not really. I mean, on the one hand, I agree with the point, like you shouldn't be training kids for Macy's, but on the other hand, it's very hard to say exactly what the threshold should be. It's at least in the time that I've spent in the space, it seems like there are multiple sort of overlapping, but perhaps sometimes in tension, theories of action at work, and so it's partly about jobs, and it's partly about good jobs, and it's not really clear where the line is. I'm not sure we would want to limit it to just jobs that require an associate's degree, but if it's not clear that it's not clear is the bottom line. And I think that was my biggest takeaway, was just that it's very hard to say if we have alignment if we aren't really super clear about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And I hear a lot of it's sort of I know it when I see it, right? But I can't define it, right? And so I'm sure that if I saw a program that was giving kids what seemed like useful skills and connecting them with local employers and giving them sort of a boost, right? We would probably all recognize that if we saw it, and recognize sort of the stereotypical bogeyman of tracking if we saw it too, right? You got a bright kid that's capable of more, but they're being pushed into this pathway, right? But it's very hard to define these things precisely in a way that actually allows you to get at them through the data. So I think that's a challenge. But that's just my opinion.
Thank you very much for that. All right, so I think we've time for probably one more question. So again, this is for all of the panelists kind of as they want to weigh in, but I'm curious, our question on this is about the report really had to focus on metropolitan data because that was the data that was available, but as and if states take this on and continue this analysis within their own states, thinking about those more rural areas or even suburban areas, and kind of how and if that conversation might be different, particularly given if regional economies are becoming sort of more depressed or growing more, and then as people move from rural areas to the cities, so kind of that mobility piece, but generally just how might that conversation look within a state as they continue this examination outside of those major metropolitan areas?
Yeah, so really quickly, I mean, the metropolitan statistical areas, they include the center of the city, right? But then they also include exurbs and sort of the surrounding suburbs, right? So if you're talking about Indianapolis, right, you're not just talking about downtown Indianapolis, you're talking about the greater Indianapolis area, which is going to, that's going to involve some people who live in kind of in the outskirts too. It is true that the truly rural areas were not in our data set. And frankly, I don't know that I can speak with any authority to those. I think one takeaway for me that I'm just sort of floating and trying to see how people react to, I really think that when I looked at the data, it seemed like the jobs are not that different in Chicago, right, versus Indianapolis versus anywhere else. Like I was saying earlier, what's different is you sort of have these regional one-offs in terms of there's a particular industry, or at least my impression from the data is that there are particular industries where there has been success in forging some sort of partnership, and often they're good industries, right? But rarely do you see a particular metropolitan area or state where all 4 or 5 of the industries or clusters that I think most people associate with CTE seem to have robust pipelines, right? So, I mean, my wish would be, right, that people would look at this data and see that actually there are areas, in all of these clusters, there's at least one city or area where it seems like there's success or alignment. And how can we make sure that every city is doing at least these 3 or 4 things that we probably think make sense? But that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think there's a state role here, and you guys probably know more about this, especially if you have folks in Indiana on the line, but apparently there's a governor's workforce cabinet in Indiana. At least when I read about it, it sounded intriguing. And they've brought together both, the workforce, the high school, the post-secondary ed agencies, and they're actually tasked with that very, question, which is what are the workforce needs in the state? What do we agree? We always talk about collaboration among agencies. And then, what's our strategic plan to meet those needs? And then included in that plan is also the directive to, help high school and college kids navigate these potential career paths and coach them along the way. And so that sounds, really great. I don't know, again, I don't know the ins and outs of, of how that work is progressing, but at least the intent of that seems like the right direction in terms of, looking across the state and recognizing that the needs may be different across the state or not, to David's point.
Now, I think a big takeaway is the data is tough, and I know there's always going to be challenges, but I think it's important to lift it up and raise the questions of what stands out as positive, what stands out as questionable. But I think one thing that you guys have done, which you're always very good at, is raising good questions and sparking good conversation here in DC and in the state. So thank you both for joining us. We are at time. Thank you everybody else who joined and those that submitted questions. Hope everyone has a good rest of their Wednesday, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, guys.